So I'm going to ask a question that I've been kind of questioning my CISOs in my conversations is really from the day-to-day perspective, what has changed? And two things really jumped out, right? One was CISOs, especially CISOs in vendor companies, are now being asked by lawyers of their customers to attest that, hey, you don't have any third-party code. And so now suddenly they've become, and I've talked about a dozen CISOs about this, and they were saying about 3 or 4 hours at a minimum weekly is being spent facing the lawyers that their customers represent. That's number one. Number two, and this was a little bit more shocking, but it is true, right? And one of the CISOs I was talking to, and he was saying literally he had to go and turn off every single endpoint out there due to an exposure that was public. And he says, turning that off, where does the time for that come from? Where do the resources for that come from, right? And his boss doesn't want to hear about it. The board doesn't want to hear about it. It's his and his team's job. So number one, where do you get the time for that? Number two, and I think this is going to the core of the question, is he is not even sure he wants to turn it back on when the patch arrives. So the confidence level is dramatically dropped. So again, open question is, are we going to see a sea change of how CISOs are now going to deal with, okay, these black box third-party trusted providers are no longer trusted. So who do I trust? Number two, where do I get the extra time and resource to actually go take care of my first party, second party, third party, fourth party?
So I think Deb actually was starting to touch on it with, the bill of materials. And it's interesting because back when I was at Burton Group, I had never heard that term as far as software. So this is back in like 2008, 2005, I think. And I remember Pete Lindstrom, who was an analyst at Burton, had started. Yeah, he was really pushing that. So I think there's much to be said for that, because what does that give us? Regardless of what we call it, what it gives us is a normalized way to look at what's the overall security posture of that vendor and what's the overall security posture of that software. So from the vendor perspective, right, if you have a vendor and they're consistently showing up with CVEs and critical vulnerabilities in their software, you might say after a while, gee, I don't know if the software vendor is very good at this security stuff. I don't know if I want to buy a mission critical piece of software from them or use a mission piece of critical software for them in the case of SaaS, right, where you're not you're subscribing to it. And I think then the other side of that is going beyond just what you do for that bill of materials. It's also getting into the specific piece of software itself. So is that software, can I get some sort of external validation on it? And if you look at the early days of Veracode, and Deb was talking about binary scanning, and Veracode's one of the few companies that can scan binaries, right? And very few vendors are going to give you their source code, so you can't do static scanning, you can't do SAST, but binary scanning with SAST will work, but Veracode kind of has a handle on that. But are we going to scan the binaries, and then do we actually have some statement of saying, this vendor and this product, these are good, and we're getting very low sets of high vulnerabilities when we scan the software. At this point, the market hasn't really come out and absolutely demanded that we have a code of goodness around either our suppliers or our software. But I think that it would be, as Deb has been discussing, I think it would be a really strong benefit because it would help us to be able to consume. We have UL listings when we go to buy electronics. We say, oh, is that UL listed? Okay, then I have a good sense about that. If you're buying dog food, is it AFCO certified? We have these certification sets that we go to and say, because I can't go and test dog food myself. I can't test 100 different dog foods, but if it's AFCO certified, that tells me something. So I think that there is probably, the more that we depend on the software and the more complex it's getting with trying to figure out all the vendors. And as Deb was talking about, we've got libraries, got components. Very few organizations are even building all the way straight. They don't bootstrap the code 100%. They do use open source libraries. They use other components. So we're composing our software. So I do think that having some way to do an attestation against those that would be an independent third body certifying program, I think would help a lot of companies to be able to consume software in a more reliable and secure manner.
I agree. Ashwin, I also want to sort of maybe you took the topic of CISOs, right? And want to maybe twist the question a little bit more. Also, maybe I can I can reframe some of this question as well, right? You know, because in the last year we've seen digital transformation accelerate, right? You almost have a concept of a corporate CISO and a product CISO. Companies should look at these as two different elements. One is a corporate CISO that protects the corporations from risks, right? And then you have a product CISO that Deb sort of mentioned about having involved in the DevOps process, because software development is only accelerated, right? It used to be waterfall, it became agile, it became DevOps. Now it's containerization. Code goes from laptop all the way to a production servers in matter of hours, right? And so to keep up in both these different worlds by one person or one body is actually quite difficult, right? And it has comes with its own set of risks. So I almost look at the CISO's role being one that is more product focused, working with the software organization, working with an ecosystem, protecting the products from breaches and security risks, and then a corporate CISO that protects the corporation itself. So I don't know if that's I've sort of seen this trend start. I don't know if that's a prevalent trend in the industry as well that's coming about, right?
Yeah, and then also from that perspective, I don't know if you're referring to like a CISO and a CRO, like a chief risk officer maybe, but there needs to, one of the things we talk about in the vendor world as those are the two different buyer personas, you could call them, that we're trying to, capture their attention. And we think about it from inside of an organization, there also needs to be a convergence of info sharing as well. I think that's very important. So you think about that role that you mentioned, a product CISO or a corporate CISO, which I traditionally picture a CISO, which is the product CISO, and the chief revenue or chief risk officer is like the more of the brand, corporate side of things. And there needs to be info sharing, intel sharing going on within those organizations also, because there needs to be convergence. And that's something that from what I've heard from many CISO clients of ours, they're still lacking, where when one division's implementing something that's impacting the other. Now, these are both divisions that are working with third parties, if you talk about this specific instance as well.
Deb, your thoughts? Deb, you're muted if you're talking. Okay.
Oh, sorry. Well, when you talked about the issue of trust, this whole thing about trust no one, zero trust is out there. So how would you know if Orion had bad access controls around its DevOps server, okay? How would you know if that patch you're trying to download is good or bad, especially even if you run a binary scan against it? In the case of this one, in the SolarWinds attack, that Orion patch was set up so that, yeah, there's a little malware and there's a little Trojan in there ready to load, but it's not going to do anything, especially during the test process. So it doesn't activate. So you can't even validate that there's something bad in there. My question is, how come these things have become so well funded that they can think of every little detail like that through the entire supply chain process, because it has a whole bunch of complex things it does 14 days after it installs, right? So what is the motivation behind a supply chain attack is the number one question I have, because these are very well-funded nation state-based attacks. These aren't just a guy in his basement seeing if he can put a couple pieces of code together and make something happen. So trust no one, zero trust. Even then, there's not really a thorough way to protect against an insecure DevOps environment on your vendor side. And because they're so tricky about how they can put malware or Trojan into a patch update and make it so it doesn't do anything, so you can't find it, is another problem. Even, I don't even know if a software bill of materials would help with that one, but it's a start. But the trust no one is definitely important. Every time I get a patch update from Microsoft or any other vendor that's involved on my laptop, I always question it, but there's nothing I can do. I just accept it. But one day I know I'm going to get whacked through that channel. You know, I've got to update my Office next, and I'm wondering if the Exchange patch is in there, you know? So those kind of things, the trust side, we should have never been completely trusting our vendors in the first place. And we've gone from, hey, Mr. Vendor, can you sign this letter saying that you're following these best practices, to what's in the code. So we've got two things we've got to worry about: the best practices for physical security and digital security around the development teams, and then what's in the code. So getting all that together is going to be difficult, and getting that in a message that the CISO can speak to the board is going to be difficult, but it has to be done. And it has to be automated as much as possible.
And I think you touched on something really important there, Deb, about with SolarWinds. That SolarWinds, you know, there's been a lot of discussion for the really nerdy security types. There's been a whole lot of complaint and argument about, was SolarWinds an attack or was it intelligence gathering? You know, and it's so in general people call it an attack, but there's a lot of people that say, well, they didn't actually necessarily exfiltrate data. Well, to that I would say yet. Because anytime that you're doing intelligence gathering, it's usually the precursor to some form of a campaign or an attack. So right now, it appears that most of what's being seen post SolarWinds was that it was absolutely intelligence gathering. And as Deb was pointing out quite rightly, you know, that when it's nation state funded, they have a whole lot of resources beyond just a small group saying, hey, let's go do crime, right? They tend to be very well funded, very well resourced. And then something like SolarWinds, I think we're going to see a pretty big long tail out of that, because if you've got adversaries within your network observing quietly, you know, we all talk about ransomware because ransomware is something that's right, it's immediate, it's in our face, but that's the equivalent of a smash and grab. You know, the power went out and a couple people are trying to run out with televisions. It's very loud. It announces itself. It can be used by sophisticated attackers as distractionware or at a very, very precise time. But a lot of ransomware is just kind of this smash and grab sort of approach. When you've got adversaries that are well funded and are playing the long game, intelligence gathering is how they create that baseline to know that they're going to, in the next couple of weeks, months, even possibly years, be able to launch a very, very sophisticated attack. So I agree, you know, looking at these intelligence gathering and what we've seen with some of the recent, I also am concerned about what goes on with the MS Exchange attack. It is on-prem. If you don't have an Exchange on-prem server, you're okay. If you're using Exchange in the cloud, you're okay. But with the on-prem, you know, there've been some ransomware attacks off of it. Some people are saying, well, there haven't been big data dumps from the mail, so that means that it's all good, right? But it could be that they're waiting for an appropriate time. You think about, now the DNC was not part of the Exchange attack, right? The DNC attack from 2016, I get that they're separate, but I'm bringing this up as an example for a time frame. When they got the data from the DNC dump versus when they used it at an extremely opportune time in the political cycle. So I think that we do not know yet what's going to come out fully from some of this, the Exchange vulnerability, because I think that these attackers may well be, they're looking at what they've got, they're figuring out how to monetize it, and they will wait to the most opportune time to let people know what they found.